I'm going back to that just to finish that and that thing from Gil Student. Yeah, so he presented Rabbi Nathaniel Helfgott's response to the question of the genocide of Amalek. So he posited that there is something called an inner moral voice, something like that, and that our inner moral voice has standing. It deserves to be heard, and our inner moral voice is in conflict with, or for many of us, our inner moral voice is in conflict with the notion of a genocide of any people. And so how do we resolve that? With the mitzvah to wipe out Amalek. So he imagines at first that you have a people living somewhere peaceably, and somehow we come on information that these people are Amalek. We know that conclusively, and all the requirements are in place. We have a king. And so the understanding is that we have a mitzvah to wipe them out, man, woman, and child, and that stands in conflict with a kind of our inner sense of morality. And the question is what to do about that. What are we supposed to, how are we supposed to think about that? So what Rabbi Helfgott does is he cites the Rambam. The Rambam was in the 6th chapter of the Book of Kings, and that is why we're looking at this. Lois found this in response to our discussion about that. The Rambam there, who surprisingly says that you can present a peace option to Amalek. So what would happen is, let's say you have that scenario where, again, there's this people living peaceably. It is discovered that they are in fact descendants of Amalek. And so we, the Jewish people, would then present to them the option of living according to the Noahide laws. If they agree to live according to the Noahide laws, they can continue a peaceable existence with integrity. Now the Rambam did add another feature, which is they agreed to be subject to the Jewish nation. He, in this presentation, does not mention that detail, but we saw that over there. So we'll add that into the mix, that they agreed to live according to the Noahide laws and to be subject to the Jewish people. He also suggested that this most likely would happen when Mashiach has already arrived, because otherwise how else would we know who is Amalek? So it must be that Mashiach has already arrived and he's the one who's identified it. So we can assume a context where all the people of the world have been exposed to Mashiach and recognize him, admire him, and are open to the teachings. This is a time when knowledge of God fills the land. Ki mola haaretz dea et Hashem, the earth will become filled with knowledge of God. And so the decision to follow the Noahide laws and to be subject to Mashiach would be an easy one for the people. They'd want to do it of their own anyways, so you're not asking a lot of them. And so it would end without the destruction of Amalek. In other words, it wouldn't be a literal destruction of Amalek, it would be like a moral destruction of Amalek. Amalek would cease to exist as the entity it was because it's now transformed. Sort of like in Yonah, when it says in 40 days, Yonah tells the people of Nineveh, in 40 days, Nineveh will be destroyed or overturned. So they do tshuva, they repent, and therefore they are not destroyed. But the commentaries say God's prophecy, in some sense, still comes true because they're transformed. They are overturned, and the old Nineveh ceases to exist. Maybe something like that. I don't know. But anyways, the Rambam is open to this option. He imagines this option. He imagines it in the time of Mashiach, and therefore he's sort of resolved the moral, the conflict between our inner moral voice and God's command. But Gil's student is suggesting he hasn't done away with the problem. He's only mostly eliminated it, but there's still a narrow area of concern. So he imagines the following scenario. Let's say the Jewish people are in a war, and while they're in a war, they come across a people in the territory where battles are happening and discover that those people are descendants of Amalek. And because it's in war conditions, there is a mitzvah, even according to the Rambam, to wipe out man, women, and child, unless they agree in that moment to observe the Noahide laws and be subservient to the Jewish people. This is not imagining a world where Mashiach's already come and the people are on their own already very interested in following Mashiach and are filled with knowledge of God. This is during a war, and the people haven't gotten there yet. So now you're asking people to give up thousands of years of tradition just so that, to follow the Jewish people. It's unlikely that would happen. It seems like a lot of people would refuse, and that would lead to the need to wipe out man, women, and child of these people. So let's just look again at starting at Roman numeral number 4. Yet I and many other people find Reb Nati's approach emotionally sufficient. Assuming we have thought this issue through, the reason for our satisfaction with this can be either because we do not consider the killing of civilians in such a situation immoral, or because we can deal with a little immorality in our religion, just not too much and not too blatantly. I suspect the latter is generally correct, but this raises the question, why do we not object to immorality in this isolated case? Is it because we consider it so obscure as to be unimportant, or because we recognize that our own moral compasses are not as finely tuned as we often care to admit? By the latter, I mean that we know right from wrong, but sometimes the distinction gets blurry at the boundaries. And while we found this case distasteful, we recognize that it is close enough to the border that we're willing to allow that perhaps our moral vision is not 20/20. But if we recognize our imperfect moral judgment, perhaps we should refrain from ever judging the Torah's commands, not because they're free from moral evaluation, but because we lack perfect scales to measure absolute morality. Or maybe we have faith that, given the enormous moral sensitivity of the halachic system, this command will certainly be carried out in a compassionate way but that our textual hermeneutics cannot currently uncover. So I think what he's saying here is that what we're talking about as our inner moral voice, or our inner moral lens, we may agree is not a surgical tool. And when there may be situations, I think a lot of us are experiencing this now, where we agree that it's wrong, terribly wrong to kill innocent men, women, and child, but we allow for it in the case of what we consider to be collateral damage. We can't totally explain the morality of collateral damage, but we recognize that it's often sort of necessary. And then it just becomes a question of how much collateral damage is acceptable. So you'll see these kind of discussions on the morality of war in general, where people are talking about the notion of collateral damage. So there seems to be maybe sort of like the trolley dilemma. There seems to be some cases where a lot of people would say that's wrong, and a lot of cases, there might be some cases where a lot of people would say that's okay, and everybody's sort of like working around what is, what will the reaction be. It's more, it seems to be more like that, like how much collateral. Let's say you have a terrorist leader who's actively engaged in causing more terror, and you target his apartment with a missile, but when you hit the apartment with the missile, you're going to kill a certain amount of innocent civilians around him. So how many deaths are considered acceptable? So they've got numbers. They have numbers. Depends on this, depends on that factor. But how do they come up with the numbers? I think a lot of times they just come up with the numbers based on experience, like how much are people willing to take. So collateral damage is one of these terms that is used to mask the issue of innocent people dying when you're trying to kill people that deserve to be killed. And so it's possible that
Rabbi, who deserves to be killed, though?
Right. Let's say this person is trying to kill you, so we have a principle: rise up and kill him before he kills you. Let's say
breeds violence. Takes two to fight.
No, but let's say the Torah says, let's say we're axiomatic. The Torah says if somebody rises up to kill you, kill him first. Abba lahorgacha, kam lahorgo. If somebody rises up to kill you, kill him first. Let's say we accept that as axiomatic. So I'm not saying you have to, I'm just saying, let's say. So even if I accept that, I recognize that he deserves to be killed. But the people around him don't deserve to be killed. And let's say my inner moral voice is comfortable. I agree with you. There are people who argue about karma and that violence causes other violence. That you could have a differing opinion. But let's say we're following this axiomatically. My inner moral compass doesn't have the same response. And maybe that's because I wasn't raised in India. But my inner moral compass doesn't have, if this guy is as a declared that he wants to harm me, I don't have the same feeling, inner moral response to him being killed. Now, why don't I have an inner moral response to, let's say, two other people? Let's say I fired the missile, he got killed, and two other people died. And let's say you do a survey and most people are comfortable with that. But that means that our inner moral compass is not a surgical tool. It's not because I worked it out somehow. That's not how I experience it. It's just that you know what? I put up around the the edges. I put up with a certain amount of. I tolerate a certain amount of what I would otherwise, in a pristine circumstance, call immoral. So I think that's what he meant. That's what he means here. It's close enough to the border we're willing to allow that perhaps our moral vision is not 20/20. But if we recognize imperfect moral judgment, perhaps we should refrain from ever judging the Torah's commands. In other words, once I accept the notion that this isn't a surgical tool, then maybe I should withhold from ever calling out the Torah or something in the Torah the way I understand it as wrong. But you do see, I mean, you see, we have precedents in the Torah. You have Abraham calling out God on his understanding of what God is intending to do to stone. He thinks God's going to kill the innocent together with the wicked. That's what he thinks over there. And God says to him, I will not kill. He says, what if there are 50? He seems to be talking about this collateral damage issue. And Avram goes, what if there's 50? What if there's 40? What if there's 30? What if there's 20? What if there's 10? And, God keeps on telling him there isn't. But it does seem to be this conversation about collateral damage. You have Moshe, arguing with God. It's not clear that Moshe does not seem to be arguing about justice. He just is trying to find an argument to save the Jewish people. You have prophets like Habakkuk and Eliyahu, which seem to be calling on God, sort of challenging why God is not meting out justice on the other side of it. Why he's not meting out justice. It seems like the wicked are getting away with it. You also see that in Tehillim. There seems to be, the authors of some Tehillim are questioning why aren't the wicked being punished? Why are they allowed to act without concern, with their wickedness, etc. So you see that it seems to be encouraged by example. They are not said to be wicked. And also Job is not, Job's friends are criticizing him for complaining, but God isn't. God is not criticizing him for complaining. So after we have all those examples, you would think that we are being mentored, that when something appears to be out of sync with what we understand to be morality, that we should complain. But he's just questioning, once I admit that my moral sense is not precise, maybe just pragmatically I should withhold my criticisms because I don't have a precise tool in order to judge whether something is in fact out of line. But he doesn't stick with that so much. And again, I think that's probably because we have so many examples in Tanakh of people that do question, and they have the same inner moral compass that we do. Now, there are people like Rav Dessler, and also Rav Elchanan Wasserman, who both are living before and during the war. Rav Dessler lives beyond the war. Rav Elchanan Wasserman was killed during the war. But they both write about how you can refine these senses. In other words, you may not everybody has the same sense of this kind of innate sense of what is true and what is not true, what is right and what is wrong. This is actually, they argue that it's a characteristic that you need to refine in order to get to a place of real clear understanding where you can rely on it. So maybe somebody could argue that. He doesn't seem to bring that up here. He seems to assume that everybody has access to this, but they do not. They argue that the average person does not have a refined sense of these kind of things, and that it's something you have to work on as part of your character development, that you'd work on, through the study of Torah and the practice of Torah. You would work on actually refining this aspect of your person as well. It may be, like Rabbi Tatz was arguing, it may be something that is given to you even before you study Torah, but they would argue it still needs to be refined through the study of Torah. So your sense of what is moral, what is right and wrong, still would be developed later on, and would only be in a real refined place because you worked at refining it. But anyways, he's not bringing that up, a Gill student. He seems to be suggesting we all have access to this, whatever our circumstances. Okay, another related issue that demands attention is the position of the Sefer HaChinuch. Rabbi Helfgott had mentioned the Sefer HaChinuch earlier. The Sefer HaChinuch had said, again, the Sefer HaChinuch is written in the 1200s or early 1300s. It is, the author is not known. There are speculations who this author might be, but it is considered one of the great, very respected, very authoritative works on the mitzvahs. It's written after the Rambam Sefer HaMitzvahs, but it's written like the Rambam Sefer. It's not exactly the same order. He does it. He presents the mitzvahs in a different order, but it's very similar. He's going through each mitzvah of the 613 mitzvahs and talks a little bit about them. Oftentimes tries to explain an underlying reason for the mitzvah, and a little bit about how the how the mitzvah works. Oftentimes, when you're looking at a mitzvah, you'll see the Sefer HaChinuch and the Rambam brought up. The premise of the Sefer HaChinuch is that a father's writing this for his son. It may actually be the case that a father wrote this for his son as a way of instructing him in the mitzvahs. So this is not uncommon that you'll have somebody bringing the Sefer HaChinuch and the Rambam. Also, there are certain mitzvahs that are considered just sort of obscure. It's not entirely clear why in each one, but there are certain mitzvahs where there's just not a lot written about them. And one of the indications that there's not a lot written about the actual practice of the mitzvah is when something like this happens, where they're quoting the Rambam and the Sefer HaChinuch. I recently was looking into the prohibition or the mitzvah of lo sichonem, that this is a mitzvah that has like 4 different branches, but one of them is that you're not supposed to praise a Gentile. Both the Rambam and the Chinuch talk about this mitzvah because it is one of the 613 mitzvahs, and they say that the reason you're not supposed to praise a Gentile is because you might develop a admiration for them and want to be like them. That's the rationale for it. The mitzvah specifically said about the 7 nations. It's when the people are entering the land, you're not supposed to marry them, and also lo tichanem. Including this mitzvah is also not selling land to them, etc. And so there's a discussion about this mitzvah. Who does it apply to? Does it continue to apply to this day, or is it just the 7 nations? Is it just idolaters, etc.? There's not a lot written about this mitzvah. The Gemara does talk about it. You do see it mentioned, but mostly you see people quoting the Rambam in the Sefer HaMitzvahs and the Sefer HaChinuch, and it's the same thing here. We go back to the Rambam and the Sefer HaChinuch. Yeah.
Just what I don't see, the Rambam, as far as I know, Aristotle was not a Yid. And he is effusive in his praise for Aristotle. So I don't get it.
Right. So that is one of the questions that comes up. There's a responsa. The responsa, well, the person who wrote the responsa is Reb Eliezer Waldenberg, the Tzitz Eliezer. I mean, he's not the only one to talk about this, but the way he resolves it is he was asked this question: how could the Rambam praise Aristotle? So the Tzitz Eliezer says you're allowed to praise. This is his conclusion from this and other places. You're allowed to praise them for qualities that we already admire. In other words, if you essentially what you're saying is he's very Jewish. The things you like about him are the things we admire about ourselves. But so, for instance, if you would praise somebody's derech eretz, let's say you would say this guy is a mensch. He's a real mensch. So according to the Tzitz Eliezer, you'd be allowed to say that about him because he exemplifies a quality that we ourselves hold to be important. So if he's a model of something Jews hold to be important, then we're not going to try to be like Gentiles. We're actually saying he's like us. So he wanted to suggest that this is the case with the Rambam praising Aristotle. Essentially, what the Rambam's saying is Aristotle has the qualities that we admire. In other words, that we ourselves aspire to. So he's so Jewish. It's as
how do they know it was going? How do they know it was going? How do they know it was going through Aristotle's mind? And how do you know the guy's a man?
No, he's praising.
And how are you going to define what's a Jewish characteristic without winding up in a circle?
Right. I agree with you. I agree with you. Aristotle. What are you asking, Jacob?
Like he had some. I feel like he had a lot of Jewish characteristics.
Well, that I'm saying, like with the Rambam, like the Toast. By the way, Toast. A lot of the commentaries ask because in the Gemara itself, there are people that praise the Persians. There are people that praise different people from different places for a certain way they do things. These people have a lot of derech eretz, the way they eat, the way they do this, etc. Also, famously, Rav Yehuda praised the Roman. There's a famous story where a Gemara which says that there was a conversation. It was Rav Shimon Bar Yochai, Rav Yehuda, and maybe Rav Yossi. I remember the three of them. Rav Shimon, they were talking about the Romans. Rav Yehuda praised them. Rav Shimon Bar Yochai disparaged them. So Rav Shimon Bar Yochai, the Romans put out a death sentence on Rav Shimon Bar Yochai. They rewarded Rabbi Yehuda, and I think Rabbi Yossi was silent or something, and he also had to go into exile. Something happened with Rabbi Yossi, I forgot. But anyways, the question was, how could Rabbi Yehuda praise them? You're not allowed to praise them. So over there, they say it's possible. One of the explanations is he's praising them for what they did for the Jewish people, you're allowed to praise somebody for doing a favor for the Jewish people. Because they ask, this is a Sefer Hasidim, this is a Rishon. The Sefer Hasidim says that he asks, how can we say v'gam charvona zachur latov? When it comes on Purim, we're going to sing Shoshanas Yaakov, and at the end of Shoshanas Yaakov, you say v'gam charvoino, v'gam charvoino. So you're saying, may Charvona be remembered for good. So the Sefer Hasidim asked, how could we say that for him? You're not supposed to praise a Gentile. So he said, you're allowed to praise a Gentile for doing a good for the Jewish people. So Rabbi Huda, that was his praise. They make all these markets and they do all these bathhouses and things like that. So they're doing good for the Jewish people. Each one has its own little branch, but the Tzitz Eliezer was saying that in the case of the Rambam, the specific guy, I think the guy who was asking the question was going to a conference, and one of the things they were doing was honoring a physician. I think it was Avram ben Avram, the physician who had a lot of responsa were written because of his questions. And he was going to a conference, and they were going to be honoring a physician who had made great contributions to medicine. So the question was, could he participate in the honor technically if he's not Jewish? So the Tzitz Eliezer was saying what he was doing, we would consider admirable. We would consider it to be a fulfillment, of a Jewish mensch would do this kind of thing. It's out of derech eretz. We consider that very admirable, to have brought about innovations in medicine that helped other people. So therefore, you're allowed to praise it, because essentially what you're doing is praising a Jewish quality. And he wanted to suggest that was the thing when the Rambam's praising Aristotle. I hear your question. I hear it. I hear the question. But the reason I'm bringing up Lo Sechanim, even though it did come up before in this discussion, the reason I'm bringing it up is because the same phenomena happens where you're relying on the Rambam and the Sefer HaChinuch. And that's often an indication that for whatever reason, not a lot is written about how to practically do these halachos. You could understand why there's not a lot written how to practically fulfill the mitzvah of wiping out a molek. It wouldn't have been a popular subject to spend a lot of time on, the practical halachic fulfillment of it for much of the last couple thousand years. But now we're getting close to it. Now is the time when you need it. So you end up going back to things like the Sefer HaChinuch. Now the Sefer HaChinuch's presentation is very disturbing to our inner moral compass, because he's saying the mitzvah applied, it continues to apply, and every individual has this mitzvah. And if you would come across a molek, it's your individual mitzvah to wipe them out. That's what the Chinuch says. So another related issue that demands attention is the position of the Sefer HaChinuch. While we are more or less safe with the Rambam's view, are we willing to declare the Chinuch immoral? Perhaps the Chinuch is free from criticism because he's long deceased, but will we declare that anyone today who finds his position compelling is adopting an immoral position? Put differently, is there room in our religion for an immoral minority position? Now again, what he means by immoral is it's in conflict with our inner moral compass. I shudder at the notion of rejecting the view of a respected sage as immoral based on our own limited and biased opinions. Additionally, for those who would, again, suddenly he calling our inner moral compass limited and biased. This was not how he was characterizing it up until now. He was characterizing it as something that deserves a voice and has standing, but now he's made it our limited and biased opinions. Additionally, for those who would denounce this view, is emphasizing the Rambam's approach sufficient to redeem Judaism? Or is it merely a distraction technique when the chinuch view exists, at least on our books? Constructing a holy moral approach, however, you define that, within Judaism is different from demonstrating that Judaism is moral. Rav Nati, that's Nathaniel Helfgott, rightly declares the Rambam is the majority, but what if he were not? Would we be justified or obligated to adopt the minority position because of our moral reservations? We suggested above that the strength of the moral claim is decisive. What about people who agree with the moral difficulty but do not consider it leads sufficiently strong to merit adopting a minority opinion? They can live with what they see as an obscure and limited immoral rule. I agree with Rav Nati's approach, but don't see how it resolved all of the important question. It shrinks the moral problem, but fails to eliminate it, and the process raises other questions. Rabbi Norman Lamb is certainly correct when he writes in Faith and Doubt, 3rd edition, page 352, most assuredly, our discussion of the halacha on Amalek and the 7 nations has not solved all the moral problems to our satisfaction as believing Jews. Along with Rabbi Norman Lamb and Rabbi Feivel Cohn, I believe we have to acknowledge our moral qualms, but still submit to the divine mandate, adopting any of the intellectual strategies suggested above. So he doesn't believe that the moral issues are resolved. He does believe that there is an avenue to help limit the conflict, but he doesn't think it entirely limits the conflict. He thinks at some point there's going to have to be a subsuming or a sublimating or a submitting of ourselves to an opinion that is in conflict with our inner moral compass. Again, last time we talked about whether there is such a thing as an inner moral compass, that there seem to be different opinions even amongst people today about whether there has to be something like that. I mentioned Akiva Tat. Rabbi Akiva Tatz argues that he believed the trolley dilemma is a demonstration of the existence of something like an inner moral compass. That Rabbi Spiro has an argument that there is no such thing, that it's all subjective. It depends what generation you live in, and it depends what country you come from, what culture you come from, and that there's no such thing as agreed upon inner moral compass. So that's a matter of discussion. Even Rabbi Tatz's use of the trolley dilemma to demonstrate it could be the subject of discussion.
Oh, by the way,
it
was Obadiah Yosef. He was the pasuk that ruled, I believe, on the. Hello?
What?
He's the one who ruled on the trolley problem.
Who is?
Obadiah Yosef.
Rabovad Yosef.
Yeah.
Yeah, but and Rabovad Yosef said that which way? What do you have to do?
You're not in the classic case when you have the 10 against 5 or whatever it is.
Yeah.
You're not 10. You don't turn the top. You're never allowed
right.
to turn
Shave al tasa. And I believe that would be something that everybody would agree on. Again, he's not talking about what the halacha is. He's not talking about what the halacha is. He's talking about, does it demonstrate an inner moral thing? There could be other times when the Torah goes against what you would think, but it doesn't mean it's right, the inner moral compass. It just means it exists.
Right. Okay. Yes.
That's all. That's all Akiva Tatz is trying to prove. It's not saying that it is this. You don't paskin based on it, but he just wanted to show that it exists. But one of the things that I don't know if he talked about it when I was in one of the treatments of it. of this the trolley car thing is that cars that are self-driving somebody has to program this in to the car. In other words, somebody has to make a decision. Maybe they'll all paskin like Rambam Yosef, but whoever's making the car, this decision has to be made because the car might have to make this decision when it's going. Anyways, okay, all right.
Rabbi,
yeah.
Just one more thing about Amalek. I was thinking about something that Jacob said last week and what we studied on Thursday about Amalek showing up when the Jews was spies, they all wanted to go back in and fight. The Canaanites and then the Amalek showed up. So maybe Amalek does mean something different, something that God visits upon the Jewish people when they go against him rather than a people.
Which, by the way,
I think I have a good way to describe Amalek.
Yeah.
Rabbi, a few weeks ago, you brought up how, I think it was in Bavaria or Germany during the Black Plague, that people blame Jews for poisoning the wells and attack Jews. Well, there's two versions of history. One that Jews were poisoning the wells and they got what they deserved, and one that these crazy Germans blame the Jews for poisoning the wells. Well, if you look at history and you do a lot of reading, there was someone poisoning the wells. It wasn't Jews. It wasn't necessarily a German. It was usually some king or some guy in charge of the province. And they just sat back and watched these people kill each other. I think that describes Amalek pretty well. The person that's, might dress up as your neighboring ethnic group, poison your well, and watch the two groups fight it out.
It could be, but you're going to have the burden of proof to you is to find instances where Amalek did what you're describing. But I'm interested in you doing that down the road.
Sure, I could pull something up.
Okay. The other thing is, Lois just mentioning this triggered a thought. A few weeks ago, I was talking to Rabbi Moshe Soloveitchik about his family's tradition that even Arabs who declare that they want to destroy the Jewish people, would be Amalek. So he said, so I asked him, does that mean that we have a mitzvah to wipe out man, women, and child of the, let's say Hamas or the Palestinians in Gaza? So he said no, that would require like a king to be in place, etc. The actual mitzvah to wipe them out. But it would still be called a battle with Amalek. There's a phrase, Milchama ba'Amalek, door. So it would still be called a battle with Amalek. So what is the point of knowing you're in a battle with Amalek? So the answer is, like Lois is saying, when you know you're in a battle with Amalek, then you're supposed to be clearly asking yourself, what am I supposed to be fixing? Because Amalek is coming as the enforcer. The Amalek is coming because we have somehow weakened our connection to God. And if that's the case, then knowing I'm in a battle with Amalek immediately requires me to ask, what am I supposed to be fixing, and to try to repair whatever it is that I'm supposed to be fixing. So I like that. Okay.